Hello, and welcome back. This is session 3 of the Health and Vitality Bootcamp, and this week we are going to be talking about fats. This is a topic that I am extremely passionate about. I think that over the years, fats have had a really bad rep, and it's not fair, and we probably need to change our thinking around fats, what they do in the body, and how we've probably been a bit wrong about them since the 1950s already. So I'd like to chat a little bit about the history of our nutritional guidelines and the advice that we've been giving to people, where that comes from, and explain why perhaps we now need to shift our thinking, shift our perception, and change the way we think, particularly about fats in the diet. So if I can take you back to the mid-1950s, there was a researcher called Ansel Keys who first published the idea that what we eat was responsible for health problems, particularly cardiovascular disease. And he and his team concluded that fats in the diet seem to be associated with higher rates of heart disease. Now, in the 1960s, the sugar industry actually paid for some research to be done through Harvard Medical School, very reputable institution, and they concluded through their research that indeed higher fat intake in the diet was responsible for increased rates of heart disease, cardiovascular issues, and strokes. And so it was from that conclusion that the dietary guidelines were drawn up. And the American Dietetic Association published guidelines in the late 1960s about what we should and should not be eating. And I'm sure we are all familiar with the food pyramid concept of what our nutrition should look like, where they said we should be eating about 60 to 65% carbohydrates, then our proteins, vegetables, and minimize the amount of fat that we were to take in our diet. And what's really fascinating is that since those guidelines were published, the population around the world actually listened and took heed of that advice. And so most people started cutting down on their fat intake subsequent to that advice. And unfortunately, we have not seen the outcome that we were looking for. So we've now had, close on 60 years of data where we've been able to watch as people have reduced the amount of fat that they've taken in their diet. And unfortunately, over that time, instead of seeing the population become healthier and fitter with less health complications, we've actually seen a rise, and quite an exponential rise, in the rates of obesity, diabetes, high cholesterol, heart disease, strokes, amputations, etc. So, unfortunately, their theory or hypothesis has not proven to be correct. And I think now, in the medical fraternity at least, we are seeing a shift in perception. And there's a lot more research coming out now around the fact that, number one, we were probably wrong about advising people to take huge amounts of carbohydrate in the diet. And number two, that we were wrong about telling people to reduce the amount of fat that they eat. So our advice is definitely starting to shift. So the first misconception that I'd like to chat about is that fat actually doesn't make you fat. Certainly, we know that fat as a food group contains the highest amount of energy per gram. Fat definitely has a very high energy density. So if you're going to have a high volume of fat in your diet, you're not going to be following a low calorie or a low energy diet. However, we have seen that people who eat a higher amount of good, healthy fat, that they tend to have a healthy lower weight. And people who take in more of the bad fats, inflammatory fats, tend to have more problems with weight, overweight, obesity, etc. So it very much depends on the type of fat that you are eating as well as what that fat comes with, because often the unhealthy fats are accompanied by processed carbohydrates and sugars as well. And I think that's probably where the confusion stemmed from right at the beginning in the research, but we'll probably never know. So the conclusion is that fat actually does not make you fat. There are, however, terms and conditions that apply. The first thing I'd like to mention is that fat is an essential nutrient. We do need to eat fat. There is no way that a human can sustain itself on a zero fat diet. Fat is very important for multiple body functions, and probably the most important practical function is that all of your nerve fibers are encased in a protection insulation lining that is made of fat. So your brain is a very fatty organ, and your brain, as you know, is very important for what you do on a day-to-day basis. So fat's an essential nutrient. Of course, as we've mentioned, fat is high in calories. So if your goal is to lose weight or maintain weight, then you do need to be careful of the amount of fat that you eat. Remember, we talked about the energy equation and looking at how much energy you take in versus how much energy you use on a day-to-day basis. So if you're eating a lot of fat, you are obviously going to have a higher energy intake, but just to be aware of that. Not all fats are created equal. So we get good fats. These are fats that are healthy. They provide excellent nutrition. They serve a biological purpose in the body, and they are very important that you eat them in your diet. You get bad fats, which, for some people may be tolerable. For others, they don't do any good at all. And then you get what we call ugly fats, what I call ugly fats. And they are dangerous inflammatory fats that you need to stay away from. And we'll talk shortly about how to identify these different types of fats and which ones you need to avoid. So from the perspective of good, bad, and ugly, we do need to individualize our recommendations. Some people can digest and tolerate fat very well, and they are happy on a high-fat diet. Their tummies work well, they feel good, they don't have any changes in their cholesterol, or in fact their cholesterol can actually improve on a higher fat intake. And so we are delighted to say to those people, please carry on, have as much fat as you like, enjoy life. Whereas other people don't feel so great when they have a very high fat intake. They might feel a bit heavy, they might feel a bit sluggish, they tend to have a little bit of stomach upset, maybe a little bit more gas, etc. And for those people, we would say, have your fat, but in moderation. Don't go overboard because it doesn't make you feel good. And usually if something doesn't make you feel good, it's probably not good for you. The final thing that I'd like to mention here is that fats taste good. Fats are what carry flavor in food. They are what makes food delicious. So if you were to remove fat entirely from your diet, you would be very, very unhappy with the way that your food tastes. And the food marketers have had to work around this. So remember, we've been told, over the last 50, 60 years that we need to reduce our fat. So the food industry said, okay, this is an opportunity for us. We need to produce low-fat and fat-free food products and obviously sell those to the wider population. But they realized that when you remove fat from food, you remove all the flavor. So they've had to compensate for that by adding additional things to those food products. So you will notice if you look at a fat-free product, it contains generally a lot more sugar, a lot more salt, a lot more flavorants that give additional flavor, and a lot of the time those are artificial chemicals that are added to those foods in order to make them palatable and acceptable to the wider market. So in general, just to remember that fat tastes good, fat gives you flavor, and if you add a little bit of extra fat, whether it be a good olive oil, a little bit of extra avocado in your salad, maybe a nice fermented cheese, you will have a lot more pleasure and a lot more satisfaction from eating that type of food. So fat gives you satisfaction. Let's break down a little bit between the types of fats. So on the one hand, you get what's called a saturated fat, and essentially what that means is when you look at the molecule structure on a fat, there is space for hydrogen. It's like a big chain of carbon and oxygen atoms, and then you get hydrogen stuck on all around. And a saturated fat means that that molecule is full of hydrogen. There's no more additional space for extra hydrogen ions to be added. Now, these fats tend to be solid at room temperature. So we're looking at things like animal-derived fats. So this will be the physical fat that you can see, let's say, on the outside of a lamb chop or a steak, as well as things like butter that contain a high amount of animal fat, and they are solid at room temperature. But you also get certain plant-based fats that are solid at room temperature. Generally, these are your coconut oils and your palm oils, and they also contain saturated fat. With saturated fats, we need to be careful. Some people can tolerate them very well, as we described earlier, but for other people, they can be inflammatory. They can have a negative impact on cholesterol and blood fat levels, and they can predispose to conditions like fatty liver and diabetes. So one needs to first know what is your own profile, and you can do that by checking your blood levels for cholesterol, triglycerides, the breakdown of the good cholesterol versus the bad cholesterol, as well as your inflammation markers, and see. And if you tend to have a lower cholesterol in general and you don't have any inflammatory potential in your blood, then it's probably fine for you to eat a good amount of these saturated type fats. They probably won't make that much of a long-term negative difference. On the other side of the spectrum, you get the unsaturated fats. And on a molecular structure, that means that you can add hydrogen to those molecules. There's space on those molecules for some additional hydrogen. These types of fats tend to be liquid at room temperature, and they either derive from plants. So here we're talking about your olive oil, your avocado oil, your rapeseed oil, peanut, sesame oils, those types of things that are liquid at room temperature. But you also get the fish oils that contain high amounts of healthy omega-3 fatty acids. They also tend to be liquid at room temperature and very, very healthy for you. Unsaturated fats are cholesterol-free, so they don't seem to have any negative impact on cholesterol or blood fat levels. In fact, most of the time, one will see a significant improvement, particularly in the good cholesterol levels, when you start to introduce more of these healthy fats in your diet. There are differences between types of unsaturated fats. So you get monounsaturated fats. Olive oil is a good example there, where there's only space for one extra hydrogen on the molecule structure. And then you get polyunsaturated fats, where if you look at the molecule, you could add potentially 2 or 3 or more hydrogen atoms onto that molecule structure. From a physiological perspective, we tend to promote more of the monounsaturated fats because they tend to have more health benefits. But to be fair, whether it's monounsaturated, polyunsaturated, they are all heart healthy fats that tend to be much better for you. Now, we need to talk about what I call the ugly fats. Now, these are the types of fats that are not good for anybody. It doesn't matter who you are, ugly fats are ugly and they are going to cause problems. So, there are two ugly fats that I'd like you to be on the lookout for when you do your shopping and when you do your reading of your food labels. The first is artificially hydrogenated vegetable oil. What that means is that in a laboratory, they take an oil, let's say for example olive oil, it's a nice, beautiful, clear, golden liquid at room temperature in its natural state. They then either treat it with chemicals or heat and they add hydrogen to that oil, which then turns it into a solid kind of a product. So an example is margarine, where they take a vegetable oil, they hydrogenate it, that's the process of adding hydrogen to that oil, it becomes a more solid product and it turns into a spread. These are not good for you. As much as the food marketers will put on beautiful little hearts, you'll see the advert with that beautiful family, they look to be in the happiest time of their life and all healthy and wonderful, but actually you are far better off eating butter than you are eating margarine, because butter is a healthy, unprocessed, natural product that has not had any chemical manipulation, whereas margarine, because it's created in a laboratory, it is an unnatural process. It has definitely got a more inflammatory potential, and in the long term that's not good for you. So please try to avoid the artificially hydrogenated vegetable oils. The second ugly fat, and these are fats that in some countries have been outlawed completely. They are called trans fats. In the United States, for instance, trans fats are illegal. You cannot sell food products that contain trans fats in the US of A. In other countries around the world, obviously food legislation is different and you'll still be able to find products that contain trans fats, but they are very, very bad for you. Highly inflammatory, they're very aggressive to the blood vessel system, not good for cholesterol levels, you need to avoid them. So when you're doing your shopping, if you see a food article that says that per 100 grams it contains 0.5 grams of trans fats, put the product back on the shelf and look for another one. You don't need trans fats in your life. What you do need in your life, however, are the healthy fats. And here we're going to talk about some examples of the healthiest fats that are good for you that I generally recommend people have more in their diet. The best sources of healthy fats are extra virgin cold pressed olive oil. So let's talk about that for a minute. The extra virgin part of the name means that those olives are taken and they're squished, and the first bit of oil that comes out is harvested. And that's the part that's called extra virgin. It's the first bit of oil that comes out from pressing a particular product, whether it's an olive, whether it's a seed, whether it's a nut. So when you read a food label and it says extra virgin, this is a good thing to have. The second thing that you'll read is cold pressed. Now that means that there's no additional heat added to the extraction process. So all that happens is that those olives are squished and the oil is extracted. And that's the healthiest, most natural way to get oil out of any product. As soon as you add heat, particularly to certain types of vegetable oils, it can change the molecular structure and it can make them a little bit more inflammatory or a little bit more unhealthy. So to look for minimally processed virgin oils that have been cold pressed is a very, very good idea. The second source of excellent healthy fats is nuts and seeds. And any nuts, any seeds are wonderful for you. Almonds are particularly good because they contain a higher proportion of protein, a higher proportion of fiber, and less sugar comparing, let's say, to macadamia nuts or cashew nuts. So, from the perspective of which is the best nut for you, we generally recommend almonds and walnuts because of their additional nutrient contents. But any nuts and seeds that you enjoy are excellent for good healthy fats in the diet. The third is oily fish. And when we talk about oily fish, we talk about salmon, mackerel, sardines, even tuna is classified as an oily fish. These are fish that contain a higher level of the omega-3 fatty acids. And remember, those are really good from the perspective of heart disease, blood vessel health, but also for the nerve system, because those omega-3 fatty acids are really what make up that insulation lining around the nerve cells, and very, very good for prevention of dementia as well as for good mental performance and concentration. Remember, your avocados are amazing. Number one, they are delicious. Number two, they're very versatile. I mean, you can have guacamole, you can add them to salads, but you can even make a delicious ice cream using avocado. It's a wonderful, wonderful fruit. And the oils in avocado are phenomenal from the perspective of health, excellent for hair, skin, and nails. They are simply wonderful. You can have an avocado a day and it will not negatively affect your weight. So please do not be afraid of including some avocado in your diet wherever you can. And finally, the last good healthy fat that I'd like to talk about is dark chocolate. This makes people very, very, very happy. When we talk about dark chocolate, we must remember that the cocoa solid content is really what you need to look for. You need to have more than 70% cocoa solids for it to be considered a healthy fat, because then the amount of sugar in the product is outweighed by the proportion of healthy fat in there. Again, you can have up to 100 grams of dark chocolate per day, and this will have far more health benefit for you than any potential risk. So enjoy your dark chocolate, add it to your desserts. If you're having a little bit of a sugar craving, go ahead, this will satisfy you. Now to shift gear a little bit and talk about the worst and most detrimental fats that I will ask you to avoid if possible. These are generally found in processed and deep fried foods. And remember that when you're looking on food labels, you need to look for artificially hydrogenated vegetable oils, and you need to look out for the trans fats. So you'll find these generally in mass-produced snacks, cookies, salted biscuits, that type of thing, in your fast foods, in your vegetable oil spreads like your margarines, in your deep fried foods, as well as in your coffee creamer and your processed cheeses. There are alternatives to all of these foods that are healthier and that are better for you. So you will definitely be able to make better choices than having to opt for foods that contain hydrogenated vegetable oil or trans fats. So if there's one message that I will ask that you remember from this particular session, it's to try and avoid those unhealthy, ugly fats, because they have a very negative impact on your body. The bad fats are responsible for high levels of inflammation. We definitely see increased levels of diabetes. They cause fatty liver. They cause digestion issues. irritable bowel, inflammatory bowel disease. They have very negative impacts on your cholesterol and your blood fat levels. They can even cause nerve toxicity and predispose to dementia. So Parkinson's, Alzheimer's, senile dementia, that type of thing, which nobody wants. So again, please, please, please try and avoid the bad fats if you can. So the message that I'd like to convey in closing is that we probably do need to have a little bit more fat in our diet than what we have been doing over the last 50 to 60 years. Eating fat does not make you fat. Fat provides very important functions in the body. Number one, it insulates our organs. So your kidneys, for instance, have got a nice layer of fat around them because they're not protected by any bone structure. So that helps if you get a blow to the back, or if you fall, or if you injure yourself. Your kidneys, which are vital for your survival and for elimination of waste, are then protected. Fat is also very good for insulation and for temperature control. Particularly people who live in a colder climate will understand that being able to keep warm is really, really important, and fat helps with that. It also provides a very important aesthetic function. Men and women deposit fat in different places in the body. For men, they tend to have more fat deposited internally around the organs, which can be a negative thing if that fat is in excess. But in women, we tend to have fat around our bum, around our thighs, in the breast tissue, and this gives us our shape and the appeal from an aesthetic perspective to the opposite sex, which is very important as well. It makes us feel good. Fats are also responsible for the production of certain hormones. The sex hormones, for instance, are predominantly derived from fat, and again, very important for how we look and how we feel and how our bodies work. Each and every cell in your body, and remember that you are made of billions of individual cells that are each performing their specific function. But each of those cells has a cell membrane that controls influx and outflow of various chemicals and nutrients and oxygen, etc. And that cell membrane is composed of fat. And you'll be amazed, it's primarily composed of cholesterol. So we need fat and we need cholesterol because that's what makes up the cell membrane, and that's what keeps our cells healthy and happy. And finally, fat is also responsible for the function and the absorption of certain vitamins. Vitamin A, which is very important for eyesight, vitamin D, which is essential for the health of your bone, your teeth, your skeleton, as well as vitamin E, very, very important for your tissues, hair, skin, and nails, etc. These are all what we call fat-soluble vitamins. And you need to have some fat in order to absorb those vitamins and for those vitamins to work correctly in the body. So we definitely need to have some fat in our diet so that we can have all of these body functions working at an optimal level. And so what I'd like you to do, please, is to have a look at the types of fats that are in your diet at the moment and stay away from the bad, saturated, unhealthy fats and choose more of the heart-healthy, good fats that you know will, number one, be delicious and satisfying, but number two, will also do good work for you in your body. I hope that this lecture has provided you with a little bit more insight into the history of our diet guidelines, as well as how fats are used in the body, the importance of fats, and that you feel a bit more empowered to choose healthier fats and to make healthier choices. I look forward to seeing you next time.